The sun was setting behind the trees when I pulled up to my lake cabin, a place I had dreamed of living in for years. My truck was packed with boxers, tools, and everything I needed to start a new life of peace and quiet. But before I could even unload, a furious woman stormed down the gravel road. She called herself the HOA president, though I never signed up for any HOA without hesitation. She shouted threats and pulled out her phone. Minutes later, flashing blue lights reflected off the water as police cars rolled in. My heart raced, but I stayed calm, because I knew something she didn't. The road she lived on, the very road she drove every single day, wasn't hers. It wasn't even the HOA's, it was mine. And by the time this fight was over, Karen would regret ever calling those cops. The lake always had a way of pulling me back. I had been away for years, busy with work in the city, but in the back of my mind, I kept picturing the water's calm surface in the early morning, the sound of loons calling at night, and the quiet whisper of pine trees when the wind shifted. When the opportunity came to finally settle into my old family cabin, I took it without hesitation. I wanted peace, a slower rhythm, something that felt like it belonged to me in a world that seemed to be moving faster and faster. I had no idea that my search for peace would put me on a direct collision course with a woman who thought she owned everything around the lake. That first day, my truck was loaded down with boxes and furniture, some tools, and a cooler packed with sandwiches and drinks. I was ready to spend the weekend setting up, cleaning the cabin, and maybe even casting a line off the dock if I finished early. The gravel road leading to the property was rough and narrow, but it was the same road my grandfather used when he first built the cabin decades ago. I remembered riding in the back of his pickup, holding on tight as we bumped along that same path, heading toward the water. It gave me a nostalgic kind of comfort just to be driving it again. The cabin itself sat tucked under tall trees, with a view of the lake that could make you stop breathing for a second. The roof needed some work, and the porch sagged in a corner, but it was mine now. That thought warmed me more than the sun on my shoulders as I killed the engine and stepped out onto the dirt driveway. I stretched my arms, hearing the crunch of leaves under my boots, and felt that old familiar peace wash over me. This was home, or at least, it was supposed to be. I hadn't even started unloading the truck when I noticed movement down the road. A shiny SUV was barreling toward me, throwing up clouds of dust in its wake. The tires squealed as it came to a stop, and the door flung open before the engine had even died. Out stepped a woman, maybe in her 50s, with sharp sunglasses perched on her nose, her hair dyed a shade of blonde that the sun had no business creating. She was already frowning as she marched toward me, her heels clacking against the gravel, even though heels had no place on that kind of road. "Excuse me?" she barked, her voice carrying across the trees like a siren. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Moving in?" I said simply, nodding toward my truck full of boxers. "Not here. You're not," she snapped, planting her hands on her hips. "This is HOA property. You can't just show up and do whatever you please. Didn't you get the rules?" I frowned, wiping my hands on my jeans. "I'm not in your HOA. I own this cabin. Been in my family for years," she scoffed, letting out a laugh so sharp it sounded like glass breaking. "Everyone around this lake falls under the homeowners association. Everyone. That means you too. You can't just move in without approval. There are fines, applications," and I held up a hand, already tired of the noise. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you're talking to, but I'm not under your HOA. I've got my deed, I've got the tax records, and I'm standing on my own land." Her mouth fell open like she couldn't believe someone had dared to talk back to her. Her face went red, and she jabbed a finger at me as though she could poke a hole in my chest with it. "You're trespassing. You don't belong here. I'll have you removed within the hour." I let out a short laugh. "Good luck with that." Her phone was in her hand before I could even turn back to the truck. "I'm calling the cops," she hissed. "You'll regret this. Nobody disrespects the HOA, especially not me." I wanted to roll my eyes, but I held back. "Do what you gotta do," I told her calmly. "I'll be right here unloading my stuff." Her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. She stormed back to her SUV, phone pressed to her ear, and began pacing up and down the road like some kind of general, preparing for battle. I ignored her and grabbed the first box from the truck, carrying it inside the cabin. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was the kind of adrenaline you get when you know you're about to prove someone dead wrong. By the time I had hauled in a second box, I heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance. Karen, the name I later learned, was standing tall now, hands folded across her chest like she had just summoned the cavalry. She smirked at me as if she'd already won. "You're finished," she muttered under her breath. Loud enough for me to hear. Two police cars pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue against the trees. The officers stepped out, their hands resting casually on their belts, and looked between Karen and me. She rushed toward them as though they were long lost friends, pointing back at me like she'd caught a criminal in the act. "Officers, arrest him," she demanded. "He's trespassing on HOA property, moving in without authorization, breaking at least 3 of our codes." The officers exchanged a look that said they weren't sure what they'd just walked into. One of them turned to me. "Sir, do you live here?" I do now, I replied calmly. I own this cabin. Got the deed in my glove box if you want to see it. Karen threw up her hands. Don't listen to him. He's lying. He's trying to steal property that doesn't belong to him. I walked over to my truck, pulled out the thick envelope with my paperwork, and handed it to the officer. He took his time flipping through the deed, the survey maps, and the tax records. I watched his eyebrows lift slightly as he read the details. When he was finished, he nodded and handed it back to me. Everything checks out, he said. This property is yours, Karen? Nearly shrieked. What? No, that's impossible. Everyone has to answer to the HOA. The second officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, HOAs only apply to properties that agree to the covenants. If his land isn't part of your association, you have no authority here. Karen's face twisted with fury, her lips trembling as though words had failed her for the first time in her life. This isn't over, she hissed at me. I will find a way to get rid of you. You'll see. The officers gave her a warning about filing false claims, then left as quickly as they had come. Karen stomped back to her SUV, slamming the door so hard it echoed across the trees, and peeled away down the road in a spray of gravel. I stood there for a moment, my paperwork still in hand, the cabin quiet behind me, and the lake glittering through the trees. My peace had been shattered before it even began, but something inside me said this was only the start. I didn't know yet that the road Karen had driven down, the very road she used every single day, wasn't hers. It wasn't even it was mine. And soon, that fact would turn this whole fight upside down. After the police left and Karen sped off in a storm of gravel and fury, the lake returned to its natural stillness. The sound of crickets swelled in the trees, and the evening breeze rippled through the water, as if nothing had happened. But my peace was broken. I knew she wasn't finished. People like Karen didn't back down after one failed attempt. They thrived on control, and they hated when someone proved them wrong. As I stood on my porch, holding a cold beer and watching the sun sink into the lake, I felt the weight of her promise hanging in the air. This isn't over. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. I worked on unpacking, fixing the front steps, and clearing out some fallen branches in the yard. The cabin was starting to feel like mine again. I hung old fishing rods on the wall, swept the dusty floors, and even restored the wood-burning stove that my grandfather had once relied on. But even as I worked, I kept catching glimpses of her SUV at the far end of the road. She was watching, circling like a hawk. I told myself to ignore it, but a knot of unease sat in my stomach. It wasn't long before the first real problem showed up. One morning, a delivery truck carrying new lumber for the dock repairs stopped short at the end of the gravel road. The driver called me, confused and irritated, saying a woman had blocked the road with her vehicle and refused to move. I sighed, grabbed my keys, and walked down to see for myself. Sure enough, there she was, Karen, standing tall beside her SUV, arms crossed, glaring like a gatekeeper to the underworld. You're not getting deliveries here, she snapped before I could even open my mouth. No construction, no repairs, nothing. You're violating HOA policy. I already told you, I'm not in your HOA, I said, my voice steady. You don't control what I do here. She tilted her head, smiling with smug confidence. Maybe, not yet, but you'll find it's impossible to live here without playing by my rules. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. I can make your life very, very difficult. I clenched my jaw, holding back the urge to snap at her. Instead, I walked past, spoke to the delivery driver, and helped guide him through once. She finally moved her SUV though, not before dragging it out like some victory march. The lumber was unloaded, but I could feel her eyes burning into me the whole time. That night, I sat at the cabin table, staring at my old deed by lantern light. The papers were weathered, the ink fading in places, but one section stood out in bold clarity. Access road included in parcel. My grandfather had told me stories about how the road had been carved out long before the lake community expanded, how it had been considered part of the property, not a public path. Back then, I hadn't paid much attention. But now, the words rang louder than ever. Could it be? Was the road itself mine? The thought lit a spark inside me. If that was true, then Karen had been using my land every day without permission. The irony was almost too rich. She had called me a trespasser, but she was the one trespassing every single time her tires hit that gravel. The idea sent a thrill through me, but I needed proof, solid, undeniable proof that could stand up to her inevitable fight. The following morning, I drove into town. The courthouse was a squat brick building with squeaky floors and the faint smell of old paper. I explained what I needed, and the clerk led me into a back room where rows of dusty cabinets held decades of property records. Hours passed as I sifted through survey maps, plats, and deeds, my fingers smudged with ink and dust. Finally, I found it, a detailed map from nearly 60 years ago, stamped and signed, showing the cabin lot and a thick black line marking the road. Clear as day, it was listed as part of the original property. I leaned back in my chair, grinning for the first time since Karen had stormed into my life. It was mine. The road was mine. She had been driving on it for years without ever realizing. She was trespassing on private land. Suddenly, all her threats, all her posturing, seemed almost laughable. She was standing on quicksand and didn't even know it. I made copies of everything, maps, deeds, notes, and filed them neatly into a folder. Then I contacted an old friend of mine, a lawyer named David, who owed me a favor. Over coffee, I explained the situation, showing him the paperwork. He chuckled, shaking his head. She called the cops on you, he asked. Right in front of my cabin, I said, and blocked deliveries. She thinks she runs the whole lake. Well, he said, flipping through the documents, it looks like she's been running her little HOA circus on your stage. This road is part of your land, no question. If she keeps harassing you, you can file for trespass. Hell, you could even block the road entirely if you wanted. The thought made me laugh. Karen, the queen of the HOA, cut off from her own house because of me. I didn't want to be cruel, but part of me enjoyed the idea. Still, I didn't want a war with my neighbors. I just wanted peace. David suggested drafting a formal notice, polite but firm, letting her know the facts and setting boundaries. If she crossed the line again, we'd escalate legally. I returned to the cabin with a new sense of calm. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just defending myself. I had the upper hand. The lake was quiet that evening, the sky painted with streaks of orange and purple, and I sat on the dock with my feet in the water, folder resting beside me. Karen had no idea what was coming, but peace never lasted long with her. The very next day she was back, storming down the road with that same fire in her eyes. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 other HOA board members trailed behind her like backup dancers, their faces set with the kind of determination that made me want to laugh. They surrounded me in the driveway, forming a little half circle like they were about to stage an intervention. You've been warned, Karen declared, her voice loud and theatrical. You cannot move in without HOA approval. You are in violation of multiple codes. If you continue, we will fine you, sue you, and remove you by force if necessary. I leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, and let her finish. When she was done, I reached behind me and pulled the folder into view. Slowly, deliberately, I opened it and held up the old survey map, pointing to the thick black line that marked the road. This, I said calmly, is mine. The road, the path you take to your house every day, it belongs to me. And every time you set foot on it without my permission, you're trespassing. Her face drained of color, then flushed crimson, as though the blood in her body couldn't decide where to go. That's a lie, she spat. You forged that. The HOA owns the roads. No, I said, handing her a certified copy from the courthouse. This is the original plat, signed, stamped, and recorded decades ago. The HOA has no claim here. If you doubt me, take it to your lawyer. But next time you block a truck or step foot on this road, you'll be facing trespassing charges. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. The 2 board members looked at each other nervously, clearly less sure of themselves than Karen was. She stammered for a moment, tried to form a retort, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, with a furious growl, she snatched the paper from my hand, crumpled it, and stormed off. The other 2 followed, casting uneasy glances back at me as they left. As I watched her disappear down the road, I realized something important. This wasn't just about property lines or HOA rules anymore. This was a battle of pride, and Karen was the type of person who would rather burn everything down than admit defeat. But unlike her, I wasn't fighting for ego. I was fighting for peace, for my home, for the right to sit on my porch and watch the lake without fear of harassment, and I had just discovered the one weapon she could never take away from me. Karen didn't take long to make her next move. I knew it the moment I saw her SUV parked crooked at the end of the road the following morning, half blocking the way like some kind of toll gate. She stood outside it, arms folded, as though daring me to try and pass. I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching her from a distance, and for a moment I considered ignoring her. But then I remembered the lumber I had waiting to be delivered that afternoon, and I knew this was going to become a problem fast. I set my mug down and walked toward her slowly, hands tucked into my pockets. She straightened up when she saw me coming, her lips curling into that smug little smile I'd already come to hate. You think you've outsmarted me? She said coldly, waving those papers around, trying to scare me. But let me tell you something you're not going to. When the HOA has been here for 30 years, we're not going to bow to some outsider who thinks he's clever with old maps. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my tone calm. I'm not trying to outsmart anyone. I just want to live in peace, fix up my cabin, and enjoy the lake. You're the one making this a war. Her eyes narrowed, and for a second I thought I saw a flicker of doubt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Peace. She scoffed. You don't get peace here unless you earn it. And that means following our rules. You can't just buy your way into this community and expect us to roll over. I shook my head slowly. Karen, I don't have to earn anything from you. I own this land, and the road you're standing on. If you don't believe me, talk to your lawyer. But if you keep blocking access, you're only digging your own hole. She let out a bitter laugh and turned her back on me, marching toward her car. You'll regret this, she muttered as she slammed the door and drove off, dust kicking up behind her. I didn't regret anything, not yet, but I knew she was planning something. People like Karen didn't retreat, they regrouped, and sure enough, by the end of that week, the whispers had started. I first heard it from a neighbor named Jim, an older man who'd lived on the lake for decades. He stopped by one afternoon while I was repairing the dock, leaning against the post with a weathered fishing cap pulled low over his eyes. Words going around. He said in his slow drawl, "Karen's telling folks you're a squatter, says you faked the deed." I set down my hammer and looked at him. "She really said that?" Jim nodded. "She's been knocking on doors? Stirring people up? Got a few believing her, too. You know how she talks fast? Makes it sound convincing. Some folks are scared of crossing her, so they nod along." I sighed and rubbed my temples. "Figures? She can't beat me with facts, so she spreads lies." Jim gave a low chuckle. "Don't let her rattle you. People round here know what she's like. They just don't always have the guts to stand up to her. But I've seen your paperwork. If push comes to shove, the truth will win out." His words were reassuring, but they didn't erase the frustration boiling inside me. It wasn't enough for her to hassle me now. She wanted to poison the well, with every neighbor I hadn't even met yet. Sure enough, a few days later, I noticed it myself. When I went into town for groceries, people who used to smile at me now looked away. At the gas station, two men whispered as I passed, throwing me quick glances. Even the clerk at the hardware store, who'd been friendly the first week, seemed distant, his smile tight and forced. Karen's poison was spreading faster than I expected. That night, I sat on the porch, staring out at the lake. The water was dark, reflecting the first stars of the evening, and the silence pressed heavy around me. I thought about my grandfather, how he'd built this cabin with his own hands, how he'd chosen this spot because it was away from all the noise and nonsense of the world. He would have hated to see it turned into a battlefield over pride and power. I took a deep breath and told myself I wasn't going to let her win. The next morning, I drove back into town, but this time, I went straight to the county recorder's office. I asked for certified copies of my deed, my survey map, and any associated records. The clerk was helpful, printing out everything with official stamps and signatures. I wanted no more questions, no more doubts. If Karen wanted a fight, I was going to fight with facts that couldn't be twisted. But while I was arming myself with proof, Karen was escalating her tactics. I came home one afternoon to find a notice pinned to the cabin door. It was printed on HOA letterhead, stamped with their seal, and written in bold letters, "Cease and desist. You are in violation of HOA by failure to vacate will result in legal action." I laughed out loud, the sound echoing across the empty yard. The letter had no legal weight. It was a bluff, plain and simple, but it showed how desperate she was becoming. I folded it neatly, slipped it into my growing folder of evidence, and called David, my lawyer friend. "She's digging herself deeper," he said after reading the letter. "That thing's worthless, but keep it. It'll show a judge exactly how far she's overreaching. At this point, she's the one opening herself up to lawsuits." The thought made me smile. For the first time, it felt like maybe the tide was turning, but Karen wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. A few evenings later, I was out back stacking firewood when I heard engines rumbling. I walked around the cabin and saw a line of trucks pulling up near the road. Out climbed Karen and half a dozen HOA board members, carrying clipboards and cameras like they were about to conduct an official inspection. "What's this?" I called out, leaning against the cabin wall. Karen strode forward, chin high. "This is an HOA inspection. We've received multiple complaints about your property. We're here to document violations." I burst out laughing. "Violations? You people don't have any authority here." She raised a hand, signaling her group like a commander leading troops. They fanned out, snapping pictures of the cabin, the dock, even the firewood stack. One man measured the height of my fence with a tape measure. Another wrote furiously on his clipboard. "Get off my land," I said firmly. Karen ignored me, her smirk widening. "You can't stop us. We're doing our duty." That was the last straw. I walked to my truck, pulled out my folder, and strode straight up to her. I flipped open the certified deed and held it inches from her face. "This is my property," I said, my voice low but firm. "You and your little crew are trespassing. If you don't leave right now, I'll call the sheriff, and you can explain to him why you're harassing a legal landowner." Her eyes flicked to the stamped papers, and for the briefest second, I saw the certainty in her falter. But then she covered it with a sneer. "You wouldn't dare." I pulled out my phone and started dialing. "Try me." The color drained from her cheeks. She turned sharply on her heel and barked at her board members. "We're done here. Let's go." They shuffled back to their trucks, some looking embarrassed, others whispering to each other. Karen climbed into her SUV, slamming the door with enough force to shake the frame, and sped off without another word. I stood in the driveway, phone still in hand, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a real sense of victory. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't untouchable. She was just a bully, and bullies only win if you let them. Still, I knew better than to think it was over. Karen had too much pride to back down completely, but now, I had leverage, and the next time she tried something, I was ready. Because every time she drove down that gravel road to her house, she was driving across land that didn't belong to her, and one day soon, I was going to make sure she realized it. The following week started with a kind of deceptive calm. For 2 or 3 days, Karen's SUV didn't appear on the road. I didn't see her stomping down my driveway, and there were no more fake HOA letters pinned to my door. At first, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had finally realized she was beaten. Maybe her board members had talked some sense into her. But the quiet didn't sit right with me. It was the kind of quiet you get before a thunderstorm, when the air feels heavy, and you know something's building. I spent those days fixing up the dock, patching some shingles on the cabin roof, and even taking the canoe out for a short paddle. The lake was beautiful that time of year. Ducks floated lazily across the surface, dragonflies zipped over the water, and the sun cast warm reflections that made the whole place glow. This was the life I'd imagined when I bought the cabin, simple, peaceful, almost sacred. But no matter how calm the water looked, I couldn't stop glancing toward the road, waiting for the inevitable storm to break, and it broke on a Saturday morning. I had just finished frying eggs on the stove when I heard the sound of engines up the gravel path. I stepped out onto the porch, wiping my hands on a towel, and felt my chest tighten. A convoy of trucks and SUVs was crawling down the road, kicking up clouds of dust. At the front was Karen's vehicle, gleaming in the sun like some kind of parade leader. Behind her, no less than 8 cars followed, packed with HOA board members and curious neighbors. They parked along the road, spilling out into my driveway like an invading army. Clipboards, cameras, even a drone buzzing overhead. They had come prepared. Karen climbed out of her SUV with a triumphant smile plastered on her face, dressed in a crisp blazer, as if she were about to hold a press conference. "Attention," she called loudly, her voice echoing through the trees. "As president of the Homeowners Association, I hereby declare this property in violation of community standards. We are here to enforce HOA law." The crowd behind her murmured in agreement, some looking excited, others looking nervous. I stepped off the porch and walked toward them slowly, my hands loose at my sides, my heartbeat steady. I wasn't about to let her turn my home into her stage. "This is an HOA property," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This cabin has never been part of your association. I've got the deed, the survey maps, and the tax records to prove it." "You people are trespassing," Karen smirked, raising her chin. "That's what you say? But we've decided otherwise. This land is part of our community. You don't get to hide behind old paperwork. Times have changed." A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Some people shifted on their feet, glancing at each other. They weren't sure if she was bluffing or not, and that was exactly her game. Speak with enough authority, and people start to believe you. I took a deep breath, reached into my back pocket, and pulled out the certified deed I had gotten from the courthouse. With deliberate care, I held it up high so everyone could see. The official stamps glinted in the sunlight. "This," I said, my voice cutting through the chatter, "is the original recorded deed. This cabin and the road you're standing on belong to me, not the HOA, not Karen, me." There was silence for a moment. Then Karen burst into laughter, clapping her hands mockingly. "He waves around papers like they mean something. Don't be fooled, people. He's a squatter, a fraud, and we will not let him destroy our community." I could feel the anger rising inside me, but I kept my tone calm and steady. "If you really believe that, Karen, then call your lawyer, take me to court. But you don't get to march onto my land with your circus and pretend you have authority. You're trespassing right now, and if you don't leave, I'll have the sheriff here in 20 minutes. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but then she doubled down, waving her arms at the crowd. "Don't listen to him. He's bluffing. We are the HOI. We decide what happens here." That was when Jim, the old fisherman neighbor, stepped forward from the crowd. He had his cap pulled low, his hands shoved in his pockets, but his voice carried when he spoke. "Karen, I've lived here longer than you've been alive. That cabin's never been HOA property. His granddad built it before your precious association even existed. You're lying, and everyone here knows it." A murmur rippled through the crowd again, this time louder, more skeptical of Karen. She whipped around to glare at Jim, her face red with fury. "Stay out of this. You're just a bitter old man who doesn't want progress." But the damage was done. Doubt was spreading, and Karen knew it. She snapped her fingers, signaling the board members. They began taking more pictures, pointing at random parts of my property, pretending to find violations. One even started measuring the distance between my dock and the shoreline. I'd had enough. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's office, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, this is my name. I've got about a dozen trespassers on my property, led by a woman named Karen, last name if known. They're harassing me and refusing to leave. I've got certified documents proving ownership. Can you send someone out?" That got their attention. Some of the board members froze, their confidence slipping. Karen hissed at them to keep working, but I could see the fear flicker in their eyes. Nobody wanted to be standing there when the sheriff arrived. It took about 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The crowd grew restless, whispering and shifting. Karen paced like a caged animal, her smugness cracking at the edges, and then the sound of sirens cut through the air. 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled up the road, their lights flashing. Officers stepped out, hands resting casually on their belts, and scanned the scene. "What's going on here?" one of them asked. Karen marched forward, waving her arms dramatically. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man is trespassing on HOA property and threatening our community. We're here to enforce our rights." The sheriff, a tall man with a calm but sharp look in his eyes, turned to me. "Sir, do you own this property?" "Yes," I said, handing him the certified deed. "And I've got the survey maps and tax records too. These people are trespassing, harassing me, and making false claims." The sheriff flipped through the documents carefully, nodding as he read the stamps and signatures. Then he looked back at Karen, his expression hardening. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this property is not HOA land. It is clearly owned by him, and has been for decades. You and your group have no authority here. If you continue to harass him or trespass, you could face legal charges." Karen's jaw dropped. "That's not possible. The HOA owns everything around here." "Not this," the sheriff said flatly. "You're done here. Pack it up and leave." The crowd scattered almost instantly. Board members hurried to their trucks, neighbors muttered apologies, and within minutes, the convoy was pulling away down the road. Karen was the last to leave, standing by her SUV with her fists clenched so tight her knuckles turned white. She glared at me with pure hatred, her voice trembling as she spat. "This isn't over. You'll regret this day." She slammed the door and sped off, dust swirling in her wake. The sheriff handed my documents back with a reassuring nod. "Don't worry about her. Folks like that always bark louder than they bite. But keep those papers close. Something tells me she won't let this go easily." As the cruisers pulled away, I stood alone in the driveway, the evening sun sinking low and painting the lake gold. My heart was still pounding, but underneath it all was a new feeling: power. For the first time since this fight began, I realized I wasn't just defending myself, I was holding the winning cards. Karen had tried to use the HOA like a weapon, but the truth was stronger, and soon, she was going to learn the full weight of what it meant that I owned the very road beneath her tires. The days after the sheriff shut down Karen's little parade were strangely quiet again. But this time, I didn't feel the same dread as before. The storm had come and passed, and though I knew Karen wasn't finished, the way she sped off that day told me something had cracked inside her armor. She had gone too far, dragged too many neighbors into her obsession, and now she had to live with the fact that people had seen her bluff fall apart. I used that quiet time to dig even deeper into the property records. The courthouse clerks were starting to recognize me by name, and one of them, a kind older woman named Martha, leaned over the counter one morning and whispered, "If you really want to shut her down for good, check the old easements and road ownership filings. Most of these HOA boards never pay attention to those." That got my gears turning. I knew my deed included the cabin and the land surrounding it, but I hadn't thought much about the gravel road. It was just a simple access lane, the only way in and out for most of the lake properties including Karen's. If there was any hidden leverage in this battle, it would be buried in those dusty records. So I asked Martha to help me. Together, we combed through thick folders of surveys, easements, and land grants dating back nearly a century, and then, tucked inside a yellowing file from the county engineer's office, we found it. The original survey from when the road was first cut through the woods. Clear as day, the entire stretch of gravel, from the highway to the lake's edge, had been deeded as part of my grandfather's parcel. The road wasn't public, it wasn't HOA managed, it wasn't county property. It was private, my private road. Every neighbor, every car, every delivery truck that passed over it did so because my family had allowed it for decades. Legally, I owned the only access point to Karen's house. I sat back in the courthouse chair, staring at the document in disbelief. It felt almost unreal, like I'd stumbled across some buried treasure. But it was real, stamped and recorded, and now it was in my hands. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat on the porch, listening to the crickets and staring at the road winding through the trees. For weeks, Karen had treated me like an intruder, a squatter, someone beneath her rules. But in truth, every time she drove home, every time she held her head high in her HOA meetings, she'd been rolling down my property. She had no idea her entire sense of power was balanced on ground she didn't own. The next morning I called my lawyer, a sharp guy named Reynolds who had helped me before on land matters. When I showed him the documents, his eyebrows shot up. "This," he said, tapping the survey with his finger, "changes everything. You own her access. Legally, you could gate this road tomorrow and block anyone you wanted. That kind of leverage doesn't just win arguments, it ends them." I wasn't out to ruin the neighbors or turn the lake into a war zone. Most of the folks here had been polite, even supportive once they realized Karen was overstepping. But I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt, knowing I finally had something Karen couldn't twist, bully, or shout her way through. So I did the smart thing. With Reynolds' help, I drafted a simple notice and had it delivered to every property owner along the lake road. It wasn't threatening, it was just the facts. It explained that the road was private property under my ownership, that historical access had been allowed, and that moving forward, I would maintain it directly. Everyone would still have the right to use it, but any HOA interference would no longer be tolerated. Most neighbors actually thanked me. They were tired of the high fees and half-hearted maintenance of the gravel. A few even offered to pitch in for repairs. But I knew the notice would hit Karen like a brick to the chest. And sure enough, it did. 2 days later, her SUV screeched to a stop outside my cabin. She stormed out, clutching the notice in her hand, her face flushed with rage. "You think you can threaten me with this garbage?" she shouted, shaking the paper like it was a weapon. I stood on the porch, calm as ever, coffee mug in hand. "It's not a threat, Karen. It's the law. The road isn't yours. Never was. It's mine." Her voice cracked, high and shrill. "You can't just own a road. That's absurd." "Absurd or not," I said evenly, "it's recorded in the courthouse. Every time you drive to your house, you're crossing my land. If you want to keep doing that, you'll respect my rights and stop this nonsense about the HOA controlling my cabin." For a long moment, she just stood there, trembling with anger. I could almost see the calculations racing through her head, how she could spin this, how she could salvage her crumbling power. But the truth was too solid this time. There was no angle left. "You'll regret this," she finally hissed, her voice low and venomous. Then she turned, stomped back to her SUV, and peeled away down the gravel, which suddenly felt more like a line drawn in the sand than just a road. Over the following weeks, the transformation was almost comical. Karen stopped calling HOA meetings at her house. Neighbors stopped showing up to her inspections. The once feared HOA board dwindled into nothing but a couple of half-interested members who clearly wanted no part of her battles. And every time Karen drove down that road, I knew she felt the weight of it, the humiliation of depending on the very man she had tried to destroy. As for me, I finally had peace. I spent my mornings fishing on the dock, my afternoons working on the cabin, and my evenings watching the sun dip behind the pines. The lake felt alive again, free of the constant tension. But every now and then, I'd catch sight of Karen's SUV creeping down the road, and I couldn't help but smile. She had called the cops, rallied her board, and waged her little war. But in the end, the truth was simple, undeniable, and written in ink long before either of us arrived. The ground beneath her wheels belonged to me, and that was the end of her reign. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment with your thoughts. Subscribe to Bright Reality for more powerful real-life stories you won't want to miss.